And now our next speaker is Laura D. Laura is an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at University of Colorado, Boulder, US. In her research, Laura uses quantitative tools to understand how ecosystems contribute to human well-being, how global change will alter these relationships, and how to best adapt management in response. It's a pleasure listening to Laura talking about how network approaches can be useful in detecting indirect effects on food production and how those tools can optimize ecosystem management. Let's welcome Laura.
Thank you, Deborah. I just wanted to say hi to everyone and that Frederick is going to play my talk because I had some technical difficulties yesterday and I was worried it wasn't going to work, but it follows nicely on from Anna's talk. So
okay, great.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Hi everyone, I'm Laura D., an assistant professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I am going to talk to you today about some of the work going on in my lab about network approaches and their applications to understand threats to food production and to guide optimal ecosystem management. And thanks again to the organizers and to the other presenters for a really fascinating symposium. Ecosystems are facing many threats that can alter food production. And these threats include environmental change, like drought and crop failure, all the way to biotic change, like invasive species through human movement of goods and consequent species extinctions. Threats to ecosystems are hard to anticipate and to manage because ecosystems are made up of many interacting species and components. And this can then also lead to unexpected consequences of impacts. For instance, if this bivalve was affected by ocean acidification, this can actually have propagating effects through the food web to have potentially hard to anticipate consequences for other species, including, for instance, fish that provide food to people. And that's really just a snapshot of the complexity on our planet, where humans are really adding to the complexity and connectivity of our ecosystems. And this map just shows just how connected our planet really is, where the light colors are showing the number of days to a major urban center, and the blue lines are indicating different parts of the world that are connected through shipping. And this complexity creates challenges for not only understanding threats from global change, but also for effective management of these threats. And today I'm going to discuss how network approaches can help with two key challenges for ecosystem management for food production and other benefits that ecosystems provide for people. And I'm going to pose this question: how can we anticipate and manage threats given the complexity of these social ecological systems and limited information and resources for management? And to do this, since I'm primarily an ecologist who dabbles in economics, I'm going to discuss applications of networks primarily in the context of ecological science and management through two cases. The first is understanding the consequences of threats to coastal food webs for people and ecosystems. And then the second is really focusing on a network of human-induced spread of invasive species and how network approaches that have been largely used in computer science and epidemiology can be applied to invasive species management at a landscape scale. So for the first case, I'm going to think about the benefits of using network approaches to study and manage ecosystem services. And when I talk about ecosystem services, I'm talking about nature's contribution to human well-being, which can range from food or fiber all the way to the role of pollinators and pollinating crops, and to the aesthetic appreciation of nature or the intrinsic value of biodiversity. And In particular, most ecosystem service work focuses on species in isolation, or the species that are directly providing services, like the birds that people appreciate bird watching, or the species that produce food for fisheries. And this could potentially be augmented by using a network approach, because we know that in reality, the species that provide services to people interact with or depend on other species in order to function for food or habitat. And so this could mean, again, that we could have indirect consequences for services that would be missed potentially by the current focus on the species directly providing services. And in order to address this problem, I led a working group at the Synthesis Center for Biodiversity Science, SDIV, that started to tackle this challenge by representing the species that provide services in a network and adding ecosystem services as nodes to this network. And by doing this, we can then explore the consequences of species losses for both ecosystem services and food webs, and do this using relatively simple representations of the ecosystem, where here the lines between species represent feeding interactions, and the lines between species and services represent that species can provide a service. So this simplifies a lot of the dynamics or information in a system that might not be well resolved in most ecosystems, and certainly not for most services. And so thinking about the consequences of species loss from the perspective of ecosystem services provided by a network, we could have a situation where there's large consequences of species loss for food web persistence, but that not for services, because the species that are threatened with extinction might not be the ones that are also providing services. Alternatively, we could have a scenario where the species that are lost are the ones that provide services, but are not playing a key role in the persistence of a food web. And finally, we could have a situation in which both ecosystem services and species in food webs are lost dramatically following species loss. And by taking a network approach, we can really start to understand these indirect consequences of species loss and how they may be coupled or differ for ecosystem services and biodiversity. So one potential way of studying this is considering robustness and using common tools from food web ecology and network science that measure robustness or the tolerance of food webs to species loss. And in our work, we then extend this to also think about potential robustness or tolerance of species loss for ecosystem services. So in work led by my PhD student, Aislinn Keys, we're asking how related is food web robustness and ecosystem service robustness? To address this question, where we add ecosystem services as nodes in coastal food webs. And these include these 7 ecosystem services. And when we do this, we then form this network, which you can see can be highly complex, with species and services as nodes. Doing this reveals that most species play some role in ecosystem services, either directly providing services or indirectly through supporting services. So this suggests that there could be a tight relationship between the robustness of services and food webs. So to address this question, we calculate the robustness of both food webs and services, simulating 12 patterns of species losses. And we then track which species and services go secondarily extinct and when in the sequence of these direct removals of species loss. Then we compare the relationship between food web robustness on the x-axis and ecosystem service robustness. And we do this for these 12 sequences. For instance, removing species randomly, ones that are most vulnerable to threats, ones that are most rare, And we do this for 3 different real world data sets. And the key takeaway here is across all of these different sequences, there's a very tight relationship between food web robustness and ecosystem service robustness. And so this potentially could mean that the many studies on food web robustness could have important implications also for other ecosystem services. So the next step in this work is to then integrate our knowledge about ecological networks with the growing field on social network analysis in the context of environmental governance, where we might have interactions among species, between people, and then between the people and species. So in order to do this, we've begun to collaborate with environmental social scientists, political scientists, and people who also use network analysis. And network analysis provides a common languaging toolkit for these types of collaborations across ecosystems. So this is work in progress, but I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. Next, I'm going to transition to a different application where rather than describing patterns in food webs, if we could then use networks to actually lead to management prescription. And this is going to focus on invasive species, which are one of the top drivers of biodiversity loss following land use change and overexploitation. They cost billions of dollars in management and damages per year, and they also threaten agriculture and other types of food production. In particular, I'm going to focus on a problem that was nearby to me, zebra mussel invasion in Minnesota in the Midwest United States. Zebra mussel are one of the most problematic invasive species in the US. And in Minnesota, they've rapidly expanded mainly by spread by human behavior and boaters, where boaters can actually accidentally have the larval stages of the zebra mussel on their boats and spread the zebra mussel potentially very long distances. And once they establish, it's very, very hard, nearly impossible to remove them. They can re-engineer ecosystems, extirpate native mussel species, and lead to recreational damage and loss of property value. And because there's no effective removal method for these established populations, the main management objective in this context is to contain the invasion and prevent further spread. And here you can see this is a very large and complex system where the blue lines are showing movement between lakes in Minnesota, and the orange dots are showing infected lakes, and the blue dots are showing uninfected lakes. And there's 10,000 lakes in Minnesota, so this is a very large system with millions of boaters. So we're asking how can we best manage or contain this invasive species with limited resources for management and monitoring. And this is a complex problem that requires interdisciplinary collaboration. So this work is led by postdoc fellow Dr. Jamie Ashander, but we've also brought together this team of computational biologists, economists, experts in aquatic invasive species and operations research. Together, we are tackling this question, and specifically, given the lack of option for eradication, we're considering the goal of preventing further spread that's propagated through human behavior. Here, we're testing the potential for network approaches to be moving from pattern description to prescription of management, asking to what extent can network structure be used to guide management in this context, and how does the performance of network guided management depend on the level of detail of information we have about the network structure. So our approach combines networks with tools from optimal management and decision science and involves 4 steps. The first is constructing network data here on the human boater movement, where the nodes are the lakes and the edges are the directed movement between lakes. Next, we then compute the optimal intervention strategy for each county for different management budgets. And we do this using integer linear programming. And here, because the primary tool for prevention is actually inspecting boats to deter people from accidentally or unintentionally spreading zebra mussel. So the objective we solve for is to maximize the number of boats inspected through locating inspection stations at different lakes. And so here, these little plus signs are showing locations that would be the ones that would be identified as the optimal places to place the inspection stations. Then the next step is to compute important places according to network structure. So we calculate common metrics that describe network centrality, including degree, betweenness centrality, and other spectral methods. Then we rank the locations according to these metrics and place the interventions in order of priority based on these ranks until the budget runs out. Then we evaluate how well these metrics do in terms of management performance, which here is the number of potentially infective boats that are inspected. And then to provide another benchmark, we also compare this to randomly placing inspection stations on the landscape, as indicated by these little orange stars. Then finally, given that information is a key constraint for effective management and adds to the challenge of managing these large, complex systems, we assess how well these network metric-based management rules perform under different information scenarios. In the extreme case, this is actually a very rich information system where we know the distribution of infected versus uninfected lakes and directed movement of people from lakes that are infected to uninfected. So we call this our full information situation. In contrast, we can then strip away that information and just have network topology. So the presence absence of a lake and the presence absence of a link between the lakes without any information on infection status or directed movement. And then there are cases in between that I'm not going to focus on. So we first consider a situation with full information that has the directed topology and the weighted links. We can then contrast that with a low information scenario where we only have the topology. And as a benchmark, because we can only calculate the optimum on a situation with full information, we also compare the network guided management to random inspection stations. And so one potential advantage of this approach, if it performs well, is that network guided management doesn't require necessarily all the information that a full optimization approach would require. So I'll show you the results. First, we find in the full information situation that the metrics perform nearly optimal, almost 99.8% of the optimum performance. And here we have the relative performance where it's relative to the optimal situation for each of the metrics and then compared to the random. So that's pretty darn good. Next, we compare this to a situation with only topology. And you can see that even in a situation with only topology, we achieve almost over 82% of the optimum performance, and all of the metrics do substantially better than random. And just to remind you, this is a situation of information where you couldn't apply the optimization approach. So we're pretty excited about that. So in conclusion, we're finding evidence that network structure can provide heuristics that get you pretty darn close to optimal control for biological invasion, but require substantially less information. And that shows a lot of promise because we're often really managing in these situations with a lot of complexity and limited information. And I don't have time to go into this, but we also find that metrics perform better for larger systems. So the counties that have more lakes and more connections between lakes, actually the metrics are performing even better. So we think that this has a lot of promise potentially for scaling up problems to these larger systems, which we've now tested in this context, but want to test in other contexts. So in conclusion, hopefully I've provided some examples about how networks can provide useful tools for ecological science and management. And with that, I'd love to thank my collaborators, particularly Aislinn Keys and Jamie Ashander, and to our funders.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the very nice talk. We have some questions. I would be really interested in your work linking food webs and social networks you mentioned. This is a question from the audience. Okay, a big problem that I always have when thinking about it are units. For food webs, it's pretty easy, but it gets complicated for social networks. What are your thoughts on this? How do you tackle this?
Yeah, you could probably see me shaking my head. I absolutely agree. So when we actually were confronted with doing this, it works in systems like for fisheries, right? Where you have a really clear link between an individual who's harvesting a particular fish that then is embedded in a food web. And there's been really good progress, work by Michelle Barnes and others, pushing that avenue forward with real empirical data. But when you start to think about other systems, one of the big challenges that we're facing is a real scale mismatch between the scale of the interactions between species and the scale at which humans are really interacting or managing that environment. And so I think that that's sort of one thing that we're trying to tackle now for particular questions or types of problems. Are there certain representations where it makes more sense? So for instance, in our case, the simplest thing to do when we didn't really have a clear match between a landscape scale service like coastal protection and the species that we provided it, we represented a known contribution of a species to that service as a node. But then, that coastal protection is then providing that to maybe a neighborhood of beneficiaries. So that's the way we're thinking about it. But you could also think about representing links as the connection between people and services rather than as nodes. And so we're exploring now how different representations might map on to different types of questions and scales. But it's definitely the units that are become tricky to apply with real data in a lot of systems.
Yeah. I have a question from myself. You show the difference in performance when you consider the network topology and the information about the weighted links and how this improve in both cases, improving relationship to random approaches to the problem. I was wondering if you think incorporate descriptions of nodes that take into account the indirect effects associated with that node. We know that depending on the direct interactions, we may end up with two nodes that show the similar patterns of direct interactions may differ wildly in their indirect pathways connecting it to the rest of the network. So do you think that you could generalize the same approach to incorporate indirect effects, or do you think that's not necessary at this point? I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the spectral metrics that are based on the eigenvalues take into account more of the neighborhood. So that to some extent would capture more of the surrounding neighborhood and indirect effects. So I do think that that could be more important in other problems. It just so happens that for this particular objective that we were trying to maximize, basically the recalculated degree centrality was almost like a perfect description of the management objective, so it performed the best. But I could see how in other cases, like if you have dynamics, for instance, where those indirect effects become really important, the epidemiology literature and stuff on the optimal network protection problem suggests that the spectral methods should perform better because they capture those indirect effects and local dynamics, neighborhood dynamics.
Yeah.
I think you're muted.
Now I think it's working. We have, I think that we have time for the last question by Shai Philosoph. In the first part, how do you deal with the fact that your networks contain two different kinds of links, consumption and service provision, but you do not distinguish between them? Does it matter? Can this be underlying this strong correlation that you find?
So we come up with a different way of calculating robustness where we then track whether or not the service nodes are lost or not. And you can see that I don't think it's totally an artifact of that approach because there's actually a lot of variation in robustness across the services depending on the redundancy and how many species are providing it and the trophic level. I think a bigger issue with it is that, in contrast to some of these more complicated or sophisticated methods like the Bayesian networks or dynamic approaches, we're missing top-down dynamics and things like that because it's purely based on topology. But we do come up with a different way of computing robustness that tracks the services specifically that I didn't have time to go into. But yeah, that's a good question.
Okay. Thank you so much, Laura. And